Hey everyone, and welcome back to English Podcast 2.0. I've been thinking a lot lately about how many of us spend hours studying English, memorizing all those tricky grammar rules and building up our vocabulary. But then when it comes to actually speaking,
Yeah,
we freeze.
you're absolutely right. It's like we've got all the ingredients for a delicious meal, but we're kind of hesitant to actually put it all together and taste it. We get so caught up in all the technicalities
Yeah,
that we forget the real purpose of language, which is to communicate.
exactly. And that's what we're diving into today on our deep dive.
Right.
We're talking about how to move beyond just studying English and actually start speaking it confidently.
Okay.
Because let's be honest, fluency isn't about achieving grammatical perfection.
Yeah.
It's about expressing yourself clearly and connecting with others.
Mhm.
And that means taking the leap and actually using the language, even if it feels a bit messy at first.
I couldn't agree more. It's like learning to ride a bike. You can read all the manuals and watch all the videos, but until you hop on and start pedaling, you're not really going to learn. You're bound to wobble a bit at first, maybe even take a few spills, but with each attempt, you get a little bit better, a little bit more confident.
Yeah, I love that analogy. So for those of you listening who are maybe feeling a bit hesitant or scared to speak,
Yeah.
how can we start to shift that mindset and embrace those wobbly moments?
Well, one of the first things we need to do is acknowledge that fear is completely normal. A lot of English learners feel nervous or even terrified to speak. It's that fear of being judged, of making mistakes, of not being understood. But here's the thing, everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers.
That's so true. I can't tell you how many times I've heard my friends stumble over their words or mix up their grammar, even in our own language.
Yeah.
It's just a natural part of communication.
Absolutely. And when we're learning a new language, those mistakes are even more inevitable, and that's okay. In fact, they're valuable opportunities to learn and grow. So the first step is to give yourself permission to make mistakes, to not be perfect.
I think that's such an important message. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that we need to sound perfect. But the truth is, fluency isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about being able to communicate your ideas effectively, even if you make a few grammatical errors along the way.
Exactly. And you know what I found helpful in my own language learning journey? Reframing those mistakes as stepping stones. Instead of seeing them as failures, see them as feedback. Each mistake is a little nugget of information telling you what you need to work on.
That's a great way to look at it. So instead of getting discouraged when we make a mistake, we can actually use it as a learning opportunity.
Precisely. And remember, the more you speak, the more mistakes you'll make. And that's a good thing because it means you're putting yourself out there, you're practicing, you're pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone.
So for those of you who are ready to start speaking, but maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed, where's a good place to begin? Do you have to jump right into a conversation with a native speaker?
Not at all. In fact, one of the best ways to ease into speaking is to start by talking to yourself. I know it might sound a bit strange, but trust me, it works wonders.
Yeah, I've actually heard of this technique before. Is it kind of like thinking out loud in English?
Exactly. It could be as simple as describing what you're doing as you go about your day, like, I'm making breakfast, I'm getting dressed, or I'm walking to work.
So even those everyday activities can become opportunities to practice speaking.
Absolutely. And here's another great way to start small, shadowing. Have you ever tried that technique?
I've heard of it, but I'm not sure I completely understand how it works.
Well, shadowing involves finding a piece of audio or video in English. It could be a podcast, a movie, a YouTube video, anything that interests you. And then you basically try to speak along with the speaker, mimicking their pronunciation and intonation.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of like you're their shadow, echoing their words and trying to match their rhythm and flow.
You got it. It's a fantastic way to train your ear, improve your pronunciation, and get a feel for the natural rhythm of spoken English.
That sounds really helpful. And is it okay to start shadowing even if you don't understand every single word?
Absolutely. In fact, it's better to choose material that's slightly above your current level of comprehension. That way you're challenging yourself to stretch your listening skills and pick up new vocabulary and context.
So it's not just about repeating the words parrot fashion. It's also about actively listening and trying to absorb the meaning.
Exactly. And don't worry if you stumble or miss a few words at first. The goal is to keep practicing and gradually improve your fluency and accuracy over time.
And I imagine shadowing can also help with building confidence. Since you're not actually having to come up with your own words or ideas, you're just following along with someone else.
That's a great point. It takes the pressure off having to think of what to say. and allows you to focus purely on the mechanics of speaking.
So we've talked about talking to ourselves and shadowing. What are some other ways we can start speaking English, even if we're still at a beginner level?
Well, one of the best things you can do is find a language partner, someone you can practice speaking with regularly. And it doesn't have to be a native speaker. It could be a friend, a family member, a classmate, anyone who's also learning English and wants to improve their speaking skills.
That's a great idea. It takes some of the pressure off, knowing that you're both in the same boat, learning and making mistakes together.
Exactly. And practicing with a partner gives you the opportunity to have real conversations, to exchange ideas, to ask and answer questions, all in English. It's a much more interactive and dynamic way to learn than just studying from a textbook.
And where can people find language partners? If they don't have someone readily available in their personal circle, are there online resources or platforms that can connect people?
Absolutely. There are tons of fantastic online resources these days. One option is to look for language exchange apps. These apps connect you with people from all over the world who are learning different languages, and you can find someone who's interested in practicing English with you.
That's amazing. So you could be chatting with someone in Italy, Japan, Brazil, all from the comfort of your own home.
Exactly. And many of these apps offer different features, like text chat, voice calls, and even video chat, so you can choose the format that you're most comfortable with.
That's so cool. So whether you prefer to type, talk, or even see your language partner face to face, there's an option out there for you.
Precisely. And don't forget about the power of social media. There are countless Facebook groups, Reddit forums, and Discord servers dedicated to language learning. These online communities are filled with people from all over the world who are eager to connect and practice their English.
It's like a global network of language enthusiasts, all supporting each other's journey. And I imagine being part of a community like that can also be really motivating, knowing that you're not alone in your struggles and triumphs.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic way to share tips, ask questions, find resources, and just generally feel connected to a community of people who understand what you're going through. And speaking of connection, have you ever considered joining a speaking club or a conversation class?
That's a great idea. I haven't personally tried that, but I've heard that they can be a really fun and effective way to practice speaking in a more structured setting.
They can be. Many cities and towns have local speaking clubs where people gather to practice their English in a relaxed and informal atmosphere. And if you can't find one in your area, there are tons of online options available.
So whether you prefer to connect virtually or in person, there are plenty of opportunities to find a supportive community and get those speaking muscles working.
Exactly. And one thing I've noticed is that sometimes we get so caught up in finding the perfect conversation partner or the perfect setting to practice that we actually end up procrastinating and delaying our progress.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that. It's like you're waiting for the stars to align before we allow ourselves to actually speak.
Yes. And the truth is, the perfect moment might never come. The best time to start speaking is now, with whatever resources you have available to you.
So even if it's just talking to yourself in the mirror or practicing with a friend who's also learning English, every little bit counts, right?
Absolutely. It's all about consistency and finding ways to make speaking English a regular part of your routine.
And speaking of routine, one thing I found really helpful in my own language learning journey is to create a daily habit of incorporating English into my life, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time.
That's a fantastic strategy. It's those little moments of exposure and practice that can really add up over time and make a big difference in your progress.
So for those of us who are maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed with the idea of adding yet another thing to our already busy schedules, what are some simple yet effective ways to weave those mini English lessons into our daily routines?
Well, we've already talked about listening to podcasts or music in English while commuting or exercising. But here's another easy one. Switch the language settings on your phone or computer to English. That way you're constantly exposed to the language, even when you're just checking your email or scrolling through social media.
I love that idea. It's those little passive exposures that can really help to solidify our understanding of vocabulary and grammar.
Exactly. And speaking of passive exposure, have you ever tried listening to audiobooks in English?
That's actually something I've been wanting to try. Is it a good way to improve listening comprehension?
Absolutely. And it's a great way to immerse yourself in the language, especially if you choose audiobooks that are slightly above your current level of comprehension.
So it's a bit like shadowing. But instead of repeating the words aloud, you're just listening and absorbing the language.
Exactly. And audiobooks can be particularly helpful for improving your vocabulary and understanding different accents and speaking styles.
That's great to know. I'm definitely going to add that to my list of things to try. And speaking of lists, I have a confession to make. I'm a bit of a list maker. I love to write to-do lists, shopping lists, even just random lists of ideas or things that pop into my head.
I love that. And you know what? That's actually a fantastic way to incorporate English practice into your daily life. Try writing your lists in English.
That's such a simple yet brilliant idea. It's those little everyday tasks that can become opportunities to reinforce our vocabulary and practice sentence structure.
Exactly. And you can even challenge yourself to use new vocabulary words each time you write a list. For example, instead of just writing apple on your shopping list, try using a more descriptive word like crisp or tart or juicy.
I love that. It's those little tweaks that can really elevate our language skills and make learning more fun and engaging. And speaking of fun, I think it's important to remember that learning English shouldn't feel like a chore. It should be an enjoyable experience, a journey of discovery and connection.
I couldn't agree more. The more we can find ways to make learning fun and engaging, the more motivated and enthusiastic we'll be, and the faster we'll progress.
So beyond those traditional methods of studying grammar and vocabulary, what are some unconventional ways to spice up our English practice?
Well, one of my favorite techniques is to embrace the power of play. Think back to your childhood, when you learned so much through games and activities. You can apply that same principle to language learning.
So instead of just memorizing verb conjugations, we can play a board game in English or have a role-playing conversation with a friend.
Exactly, and don't underestimate the power of laughter. Watching comedies in English or listening to stand-up comedians can not only improve your listening comprehension and vocabulary, but it can also help you develop a more natural and intuitive understanding of humor in the English language.
It's a great way to loosen up, relax, and enjoy the learning process.
And speaking of loosening up, another fantastic technique is to practice speaking English in front of a mirror. It might feel a bit silly at first, but it can be incredibly helpful in building your confidence and fluency.
It's like giving yourself a private stage to rehearse and experiment without any fear of judgment.
Exactly. And as you watch yourself speak, you can also pay attention to your facial expressions, body language, and overall delivery, making sure you're projecting confidence and clarity.
It's like giving yourself a mini performance review, identifying areas where you can improve your stage presence.
I love that. And here's another powerful technique. Try describing your surroundings in English as if you were a tour guide. Walk around your house, your neighborhood, or even a park and narrate what you see using descriptive language and engaging storytelling.
It's a fantastic way to activate your vocabulary practice, sentence construction, and even improve your pronunciation.
And it's a fun and creative way to turn everyday experiences into learning opportunities.
So it's about weaving English into the fabric of our lives, finding those moments of immersion and practice, even in the most unexpected places.
Exactly. And as you embark on this journey of learning and exploration, remember that the most important ingredient is your own passion and dedication. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more you connect with its beauty and power, the more rewarding your experience will be.
That's such a beautiful reminder. Learning English is not just about acquiring a new skill. It's about opening up a whole new world of possibilities, connecting with people from different cultures, and expanding our horizons. But let's be real, it's not always easy. There are times when we might feel stuck, frustrated, or even discouraged. So how can we stay motivated and keep that passion for English alive, even when we hit those inevitable roadblocks?
That's such an important question because motivation is key. It's the fuel that keeps us going, even when things get tough.
So what are some strategies we can use to keep that fire burning, to stay excited about learning English even when we're feeling a bit burnt out or overwhelmed?
Well, one of the best things you can do is set realistic goals. Don't try to do too much too soon. Break down your learning into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of saying, I want to be fluent in 6 months, you might set a goal like, I want to be able to have a basic conversation about my hobbies by next month.
Exactly. And celebrate those small victories along the way. Every time you achieve a goal, no matter how small, acknowledge your progress and give yourself a pat on the back. It'll help you stay positive and motivated to keep going.
It's like those little rewards that keep us going, those moments of recognition that remind us that we're making progress, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Precisely. And it's also important to find ways to make learning enjoyable for yourself. If you're constantly forcing yourself to study in ways that you find boring or tedious, you're going to burn out quickly.
That's so true. It's like anything else in life. If you don't enjoy it, you're less likely to stick with it.
Yeah.
So how can we make learning English more fun and engaging?
Well, I think it's important to tap into your interests and passions. If you love music, listen to English songs. If you enjoy movies, watch films in English. If you're a bookworm, read novels in English.
It's about finding those activities that you already enjoy and incorporating English into them, so it doesn't feel like a chore, but rather an extension of your interests.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative. There are so many fun and innovative ways to learn English these days. There are apps, games, online courses, podcasts, YouTube channels, you name it.
It's like a whole world of resources at our fingertips.
And the more you explore and experiment, the more likely you are to find those learning methods that really click with you, that make you excited to learn and practice.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where learning and enjoyment intersect, where the process of acquiring a new language feels less like a task and more like a passion.
Precisely. And remember, learning a language is a journey, not a race. There will be ups and downs, moments of frustration and moments of triumph. But the most important thing is to keep going, to keep that spark of motivation alive, and to never give up on your dream of speaking English fluently.
That's such an inspiring message.
Mm.
And speaking of sparking motivation, I think one of the most powerful ways to stay engaged in the learning process is to connect with others who are on a similar journey.
I couldn't agree more. It's amazing how much we can learn from and support each other, especially when it comes to something as challenging as learning a new language.
So we've talked about finding language partners, joining online communities, and participating in speaking clubs. Are there any other ways we can connect with fellow English learners and create those supportive networks?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful ways to connect is through shared experiences. Have you ever considered attending an English language event or festival?
Oh, that's a great idea. I haven't personally been to one, but I imagine it would be an incredible opportunity to immerse yourself in the language and culture, to meet people from all over the world who share your passion for English.
Exactly. These events often feature workshops, presentations, performances, even social gatherings, all in English. It's a fantastic way to practice your listening and speaking skills in a fun and supportive environment.
And it's a chance to step outside of your comfort zone and really push yourself to use the language in a real-world setting.
Precisely. And one thing I've found incredibly helpful in my own language learning journey is to find a mentor or role model, someone who inspires you and motivates you to keep going.
That's such a great idea.
Yeah,
I think having someone to look up to, someone who has already achieved the level of fluency that you aspire to, can be incredibly motivating.
it can be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be someone you know personally. It could be a teacher, an author, a speaker, a YouTuber, anyone whose language skills you admire and who you can learn from.
So it's about finding those sources of inspiration, those people who remind us that our goals are achievable, that fluency is within our grasp, if we're willing to put in the effort and stay committed to the journey.
Exactly. And, speaking of finding inspiration, I think one of the most common challenges that English learners face is the fear of making mistakes. We've talked about this a bit already, but I think it's worth diving a little deeper.
You're right, that fear can be so paralyzing for many people. I think it's one of the biggest obstacles that prevents learners from actually speaking and practicing.
It really is. And it's understandable, of course. No one wants to sound foolish or be judged for their mistakes. But the truth is, mistakes are an inevitable part of the learning process, especially when it comes to language.
So how can we shift that mindset from fearing mistakes to embracing them as part of the journey?
Well, one helpful tip is to simply acknowledge those mistakes. When you realize you've made an error, don't try to brush it under the rug or pretend it didn't happen. Instead, say something like, "Oh, I meant to say," or "Can you help me correct that?"
It shows that you're aware of the mistake
Yeah,
and that you're actively trying to improve.
exactly. And most people are happy to help. In fact, by asking for clarification or correction, you're also showing respect for the person you're speaking with. You're demonstrating that you value their input and that you're eager to learn from them.
It turns a potential awkward moment into a positive learning experience. And speaking of positive experiences, I think it's important to highlight that learning a new language doesn't have to be a chore. There are so many fun and engaging ways to practice.
Absolutely. Learning English should be an enjoyable journey. It's about opening up a whole new world of communication, culture, and connection. So don't be afraid to experiment and find what works best for you.
So instead of just focusing on textbooks and grammar drills, what are some fun activities that can help boost those speaking skills?
One of my favorite ways to practice is by watching movies or TV shows in English. You can start with subtitles in your native language, and as you become more comfortable, gradually switch to English subtitles, or even try watching without any subtitles at all.
It's a great way to pick up on natural pronunciation, intonation, and everyday expressions. Plus, it's entertaining.
Exactly, and don't underestimate the power of music. Listening to English songs and trying to sing along is a fantastic way to improve your pronunciation and rhythm. It's also a great way to learn new vocabulary and get a feel for the emotional nuances of the language.
It's like sneaking in a little language lesson while enjoying your favorite tunes.
I love that. And here's another fun activity. Try reading aloud in English. It could be anything from a children's book to a news article to a chapter from a novel.
It's a good way to practice pronunciation and get comfortable with the flow of the language.
And it also helps to improve your reading comprehension and expand your vocabulary.
Speaking of expanding horizons, one thing that I found incredibly helpful in my own language learning journey is creating a daily routine that incorporates English practice. It's about weaving those little moments of learning into your everyday life.
That's such a fantastic tip. Consistency is key when it comes to language learning. By establishing a routine, even if it's just for a few minutes each day, you're signaling to your brain that English is important and it's something you're committed to learning.
So what are some simple yet effective ways to build those mini English lessons into our daily routines?
Well, we've already talked about listening to podcasts or music while commuting or exercising. Another great strategy is to switch your phone or computer settings to English. That way you're constantly exposed to the language, even when you're just checking your email or scrolling through social media.
It's those little passive exposures that can really add up over time.
Exactly. And speaking of social media, there are tons of accounts and groups dedicated to English learning. Follow those accounts, engage with the content, and interact with other learners in the comments.
It's a great way to pick up on tips, discover new resources, and connect with a supportive community.
And don't forget about good old-fashioned journaling. Set aside a few minutes each day to write in English about your thoughts, feelings, or experiences.
It's a wonderful way to reflect, process your day, and practice expressing yourself in a more personal way.
And here's a fun twist. You can even try writing your to-do list or shopping list in English.
It's about finding those little opportunities to integrate the language into your daily life, even in the most mundane tasks.
Exactly. And speaking of tasks, let's address a common challenge that many English learners struggle with: finding a reliable speaking partner.
It can be a real hurdle. Sometimes friends or family members might not be available or willing to practice with you. And it can be intimidating to seek out strangers online.
I completely understand. But luckily, there are many resources available to help you find the perfect speaking partner. We've already mentioned language exchange apps, which can connect you with native speakers and other learners from around the world.
And these platforms often have features that allow you to filter by interests, language level, and even time zone, so you can find someone who's a good match for you.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of social media. There are countless Facebook groups, Reddit forums, and Discord servers dedicated to language learning. These communities are filled with people who are eager to connect and practice their skills.
It's like a global network of language enthusiasts all supporting each other's journey.
And if you prefer a more structured approach, you can also look for speaking clubs or conversation classes online or in your local community. Platforms like Meetup often host language exchange events.
That's a great way to meet people face-to-face and practice in a social setting. And for those who might feel intimidated about joining a group, is there anything they can do to feel more comfortable?
Absolutely. A great tip is to be proactive. Don't wait for someone to invite you to a conversation. Take the initiative and introduce yourself. Send a message to a potential language partner, express your interest in practicing, and see if they'd be open to chatting.
It's about putting yourself out there and showing that you're serious about improving your speaking skills. And remember, most people in these groups and apps are in the same boat. They're also looking to practice and connect with others.
Exactly. So don't let fear hold you back. Embrace the opportunity to expand your horizons and make new friends while honing your English skills.
Speaking of expanding horizons, let's dive into a common challenge that many English learners face: the habit of translating everything from their native language into English before speaking. Why is this such a hurdle?
It's a major hurdle because it slows you down and can make your speech sound unnatural. Languages don't always have direct translations, so when you try to force-fit phrases from your native language into English, it can create awkward sentence structures.
It's like trying to force two puzzle pieces together that don't quite fit. The result is awkward and disjointed.
Exactly. And the constant mental gymnastics of translating can make speaking feel much more difficult than it needs to be.
So the key is to train your brain to think directly in English right.
Precisely. It's about shifting your mental framework so that English becomes the language of your thoughts, not just your studies.
But how do you actually do that? It sounds pretty daunting.
It might sound intimidating, but it's totally achievable with practice. And we have some great tips to help you get started. The first step is to focus on simple words and phrases. When you see an everyday object like a chair, don't think of the word for it in your native language first. Just say chair in your mind in English.
It's about building that direct connection between the object and the English word, bypassing the translation step.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable with individual words, start practicing with short phrases. For example, if you're walking outside, you might think to yourself, the sky is blue, the sun is shining, I feel happy today.
It's like narrating your own life in English, a personal running commentary.
I love that. It's about making English a part of your inner dialogue. And here's another powerful technique. Use an English-only dictionary. When you encounter a new word, resist the urge to look up the translation in your native language. Instead, try to understand its meaning using the English definition and example sentences provided.
That's a great way to immerse yourself in the nuances of the language and develop your vocabulary in a more authentic way.
Absolutely. And my favorite tip of all, speak your thoughts out loud even when you're alone. It might feel a little strange at first, but trust me, it works. By verbalizing your thoughts in English, you're training your brain to form sentences naturally without the crutch of translation.
It's like giving your internal English voice a chance to flex its muscles.
Yes. The more you practice thinking and speaking in English, even in private, the more fluent and confident you'll become.
So it's a journey of gradual immersion, starting with small steps and building up to more complex thinking and expression.
Exactly. And remember, be patient with yourself. This process takes time and effort, but the rewards are immense.
Speaking of rewards, let's talk about motivation. Learning a language can be a challenging journey. How can listeners stay motivated and avoid getting discouraged along the way?
That's a great question. Maintaining motivation is crucial. One of the best strategies is to set realistic goals. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. Instead, break down your learning into smaller, achievable milestones.
So instead of saying, I want to be fluent in 6 months, you might say, I want to be able to have a basic conversation about my hobbies by next month.
Exactly. And celebrate those small victories. Every time you achieve a goal, no matter how small, acknowledge your progress and give yourself a pat on the back. It will help you stay positive and motivated to keep going.
It's like giving yourself those little bursts of encouragement along the way.
Precisely. And it's also crucial to remind yourself why you're learning English in the first place. What are your goals? What do you hope to achieve with this new skill?
Maybe you want to travel the world, connect with people from different cultures, or advance your career. Whatever your reasons, keep them front and center.
Yes. Visualize yourself achieving those goals using your English skills to open up new opportunities and experiences.
And remember, learning a language is a journey, not a race. There will be ups and downs, moments of frustration, and moments of triumph.
It's all part of the process. And the most important thing is to enjoy the ride. Find ways to make learning fun and engaging, whether it's through watching movies, listening to music, or connecting with other learners.
And be kind to yourself. Don't get bogged down by perfectionism. Embrace the imperfections and celebrate the progress you make along the way.
That's such great advice. And it brings us to a crucial point that we haven't really touched on yet. The power of thinking directly in English.
That's something I've heard about, but I'm not really sure how to do it. It sounds almost like a superpower, being able to just switch your brain to think in another language.
It can definitely feel that way at first, but trust me, it's a skill that anyone can develop with practice.
So how do we start to train our brains to think in English? Is it a matter of just forcing ourselves to think in English all the time, even when it feels awkward or difficult?
Not necessarily. It's more about gradually shifting your mindset and creating an environment where thinking in English becomes more natural and effortless. And one of the best ways to do that is to start small.
Okay, so what would be a good starting point for someone who's just beginning to explore this idea of thinking in English?
One simple technique is to start by labeling everyday objects in your mind with their English names. So instead of thinking table in your native language, think table in English.
So it's like creating those direct associations between the object and the English word, bypassing the translation process.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable with individual words, you can start to think in simple phrases. For example, when you're getting ready in the morning, you might think to yourself, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm getting dressed, I'm making breakfast.
It's like those little internal dialogues we have with ourselves throughout the day, we can start to shift those dialogues into English.
Precisely. And as you become more comfortable thinking in simple phrases, you can gradually increase the complexity of your thoughts. You can start thinking in complete sentences, and eventually you might even find yourself dreaming in English.
Wow, that's amazing. It really shows how powerful this technique can be. So we've talked about labeling objects, thinking in simple phrases. What are some other ways we can encourage ourselves to think in English more often?
Well, one really helpful strategy is to create an immersive English environment for yourself. And I don't mean you have to move to an English-speaking country. You can create that immersion right where you are.
So how do we go about creating that English immersion without actually packing our bags and traveling abroad?
Well, one way is to surround yourself with English language media.
That makes sense. It's like creating a little English bubble around yourself, even if you're physically in a non-English speaking environment. So what kind of media are we talking about here?
Well, anything and everything you can get your hands on. Movies, TV shows, music podcasts, audiobooks, news websites, social media accounts in English. The possibilities are endless.
It's like a buffet of English content just waiting to be devoured.
Exactly. And the great thing about this digital age is that we have access to so much of this content right at our fingertips, often for free.
That's so true. There's really no excuse for not immersing ourselves in English, even if we're on a budget.
Absolutely. And the more you expose yourself to the language in different contexts, the more natural it will start to feel to think in English.
So it's like we're training our brains to recognize and process English without having to consciously translate everything.
Precisely. It's all about building those neural pathways and making English feel more and more familiar until it eventually becomes second nature. And speaking of feeling comfortable with English, let's talk about a common challenge that many learners face: the fear of speaking in front of others.
Oh, that's a big one. I think almost everyone experiences some level of anxiety when it comes to public speaking, even in their native language. But when you add in the element of speaking a foreign language, that anxiety can multiply tenfold.
You're absolutely right. It's completely normal to feel nervous or self-conscious when you're speaking a language that you're still learning. You might worry about making mistakes, mispronouncing words, or not being understood. But here's the thing. Everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers.
That's such a good reminder. I think sometimes we forget that language is a living, breathing thing. It's constantly evolving, and even people who've spoken English their whole lives make grammatical errors or stumble over their words from time to time.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to shift our mindset from perfection to progress. Instead of beating ourselves up for every little mistake, we need to embrace those imperfections as part of the learning process.
So how can we practically start to embrace those mistakes and overcome that fear of speaking in front of others?
Well, one helpful tip is to start small. Don't feel pressured to jump right into giving a presentation or having a deep philosophical conversation in English. Begin with simple interactions, like ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions, or chatting with a cashier at the store.
Those everyday situations can be great practice opportunities. And they're usually low pressure since the interactions are brief and the focus is on completing a task rather than having a flawless conversation.
Exactly. And as you gain confidence in those smaller interactions, you can gradually work your way up to more challenging speaking situations. Maybe you join a conversation group or volunteer to give a short presentation at work, or even start recording videos of yourself speaking English and sharing them online.
That's a great idea. And speaking of recording videos, I think that can be a really valuable tool for language learners, even if you're not comfortable sharing them publicly. Just the act of recording yourself speaking can help you identify areas where you need to improve and track your progress over time.
Absolutely. It's like having a personal language coach right in your pocket. And you can use your phone or computer to record yourself practicing different speaking activities like reading aloud, shadowing a native speaker, or even just having a conversation with yourself.
It sounds a bit silly talking to yourself in English, but I can see how it would be helpful. You're essentially creating a safe space to practice without any fear of judgment.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you'll become. And eventually that fear of speaking in front of others will start to fade away.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
So we've talked about starting small, embracing mistakes, and using recording tools. Are there any other practical strategies that can help us overcome that fear of speaking English?
Well, one technique that I found helpful is to focus on your breathing. When we get nervous, our breathing tends to become shallow and rapid, which can actually make us feel even more anxious.
That makes sense. I know when I'm about to give a presentation or do something that makes me nervous, I can definitely feel my heart racing and my breath quickening.
Exactly. So before you enter a speaking situation, take a few deep breaths, inhaling slowly through your nose and exhaling slowly through your mouth. This will help to calm your nerves and center your focus.
It's like a mini meditation session to prepare yourself mentally and physically.
Exactly. And another helpful tip is to visualize yourself speaking confidently and successfully. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the speaking situation feeling relaxed, engaged, and fluent.
It's like mental rehearsal, creating a positive image in your mind before you actually step onto the stage.
Precisely. And the more you visualize yourself succeeding, the more likely you are to actually achieve that success in real life.
It's like that saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
Exactly. Our mindset plays such a powerful role in our ability to learn and grow. And speaking of growth, I think one of the most transformative things you can do on your journey to English fluency is to shift your focus from translating to thinking directly in English.
Ah, yes, that elusive skill of thinking in English. We touched on this earlier, but I'm eager to delve a little deeper. I think it's a concept that many language learners struggle with, myself included.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's a challenge worth embracing. Because when you can think in English, you free yourself from the constant need to translate, and your speech becomes much more natural, spontaneous, and fluent.
It's like unlocking a secret passageway in your brain where English flows freely without the barrier of your native language.
Exactly. It's a game changer, but it can feel a bit elusive, especially at first. So let's break down some practical strategies that can help you cultivate this skill.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we even begin?
Start small. Instead of trying to translate entire sentences or paragraphs in your head, focus on single words. When you see everyday objects around you, like a table, a chair, a book, try to think of the English word for that object without going through the translation process in your native language.
So it's about building those direct associations between the object and the English word, bypassing that mental detour of translation.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable with single words, gradually start incorporating short phrases into your thinking. For example, when you're getting ready in the morning, you might think to yourself, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm getting dressed, I'm making breakfast.
It's like narrating your own life in English, even if it's just in your head.
Yes, it's about making English a part of your internal dialogue, your inner monologue. And as you become more accustomed to thinking in simple phrases, you can start expanding to more complex sentences and eventually even entire conversations.
So it's a gradual process of immersion, starting with those foundational building blocks and gradually building up to more complex thought patterns.
Precisely. And here's a powerful technique that can accelerate this process. Immerse yourself in English language media. Watch movies, listen to podcasts, read books, surround yourself with the sounds and rhythms of the language.
It's about creating an environment where your brain is constantly exposed to English, even when you're not actively studying.
Exactly. And as you absorb the language through these passive experiences, you'll find that thinking in English becomes more natural and effortless.
It's like training your brain to think in a new language, almost like learning a new musical instrument.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of music, singing along to English songs is another fantastic way to practice thinking in English. As you focus on the lyrics and try to match the pronunciation and intonation of the singer, you're engaging multiple areas of your brain and reinforcing those linguistic pathways.
It's a fun and engaging way to learn. And speaking of fun, I think it's important to emphasize that learning English shouldn't feel like a chore. There are so many creative and enjoyable ways to practice.
Absolutely. The more you can make learning fun and engaging, the more motivated and enthusiastic you'll be and the faster you'll progress.
So beyond those traditional methods of studying grammar and vocabulary, what are some unconventional ways to spice up our English practice?
Well, one of my favorite techniques is to embrace the power of play. Think back to your childhood when you learned so much through games and activities. You can apply the same principle to language learning.
So instead of just memorizing verb conjugations, we could play a board game in English or have a role-playing conversation with a friend.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of laughter. Watching comedies in English or listening to stand-up comedians can not only improve your listening comprehension and vocabulary, but it can also help you develop a more natural and intuitive understanding of humor in the English language.
It's a great way to loosen up, relax, and enjoy the learning process.
And speaking of loosening up, another fantastic technique is to practice speaking English in front of a mirror. It might feel a bit silly at first, but it can be incredibly helpful in building your confidence and fluency.
It's like giving yourself a private stage to rehearse and experiment without any fear of judgment.
Exactly. And as you watch yourself speak, you can also pay attention to your facial expressions, body language, and overall delivery, making sure you're projecting confidence and clarity.
It's like giving yourself a mini performance review, identifying areas where you can improve your stage presence.
I love that. And here's another powerful technique. Try describing your surroundings in English as if you were a tour guide. Walk around your house, your neighborhood, or even a park, and narrate what you see using descriptive language and engaging storytelling.
It's a fantastic way to activate your vocabulary, practice sentence construction, and even improve your pronunciation.
And it's a fun and creative way to turn everyday experiences into learning opportunities.
So it's about weaving English into the fabric of our lives, finding those moments of immersion and practice, even in the most unexpected places.
Exactly. And as you continue on this journey of learning English, it's important to remember that you're not alone. There's a vast and supportive community of English learners all around the world, all facing similar challenges, celebrating similar victories, and all striving to achieve that same goal of fluency.
That's so true. It's amazing how connecting with others who are on the same path can be so motivating and inspiring.
It really is. And there are so many ways to connect with fellow English learners these days. We've talked about joining language exchange apps and online communities, but there are also tons of in-person events and meetups where you can practice your English and connect with like-minded people.
I love that. It's like turning language learning into a social activity, something you can do with friends, both old and new.
Exactly. And one of the most rewarding aspects of learning English is the ability to connect with people from different cultures and backgrounds.
That's one of my favorite things about learning a new language. It's like opening a door to a whole new world of perspectives, experiences, and friendships.
I couldn't agree more. And the more you immerse yourself in the English language and culture, the more you'll realize just how much we all have in common despite our differences.
It's like language becomes this bridge that connects us, allowing us to share our stories, our dreams, and our hopes for the future.
Beautifully said. And speaking of connecting with others, let's talk about the importance of finding a mentor or a language buddy who can support you on your journey to English fluency.
That's a great idea. Having someone to guide you, to answer your questions, and to encourage you along the way can make a world of difference.
It really can. And a mentor doesn't have to be a professional teacher or tutor. It could be a friend, a family member, a colleague, anyone who has a good command of English and who's willing to share their knowledge and experience with you.
So it's about finding someone who can be a sounding board, a source of encouragement,
Yeah.
and a cheerleader as you navigate the ups and downs of language learning.
Exactly. And sometimes the best mentors are those who have been through the same challenges that you're facing.
Hmm.
They can offer practical advice, empathy, and a reminder that you're not alone on this journey.
That's so true. I think it's incredibly valuable to hear from people who have walked in your shoes and come out the other side speaking English fluently and confidently.
Absolutely. And finding a mentor can also help you stay accountable to your goals and keep your motivation high, especially when you're feeling discouraged or tempted to give up.
It's like having someone to hold your hand, metaphorically speaking, and guide you through the sometimes overwhelming world of language learning.
Exactly. And, speaking of navigating the world of English, one of the most important skills you can develop is the ability to think critically and to express your opinions effectively.
That's a great point. It's not enough to just be able to speak grammatically correct English. We also need to be able to use the language to think deeply, to analyze information, and to communicate our ideas persuasively.
Absolutely. And this is where the skill of critical thinking comes in. It's about being able to question assumptions, to evaluate evidence, to identify biases, and to formulate well-reasoned arguments.
So how can we develop our critical thinking skills in English? Is it a matter of reading lots of books and articles?
Reading is definitely a great way to expand your knowledge and expose yourself to different viewpoints, but it's also important to engage in active listening, to ask probing questions, and to seek out diverse perspectives.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information, it's about actively engaging with it, and challenging it, and forming our own opinions.
Exactly. And, one of the best ways to sharpen your critical thinking skills is to participate in debates or discussions in English.
That's a great idea. It forces you to think on your feet, to articulate your arguments clearly, and to respond to counterpoints thoughtfully.
Precisely. And even if you don't have the opportunity to participate in formal debates, you can still practice critical thinking in your everyday conversations.
So how can we bring critical thinking into our daily interactions?
Well, one simple way is to start asking why more often. Instead of just accepting information at face value, challenge yourself to dig deeper to understand the underlying reasons and motivations.
So it's about being curious, about questioning assumptions, and about seeking a deeper understanding of the world around us.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful ways to express your opinions and to persuade others is to use storytelling.
Oh, yes. Stories have such a way of capturing our attention and connecting with us on an emotional level.
They do. And when you can tell a compelling story in English, you're not only demonstrating your language skills, you're also showcasing your ability to think creatively, to connect with your audience, and to make your ideas memorable.
So how can we become better storytellers in English?
Well, one tip is to start paying attention to the stories you encounter in your everyday life. Listen to the way people tell stories, the details they include, the emotions they convey.
It's like we're surrounded by stories all the time if we just open our eyes and ears to them.
Exactly. And as you start to notice these stories, try to retell them in your own words in English.
It's like practicing your storytelling muscles, flexing those creative and linguistic abilities.
Precisely. And as you become more comfortable with retelling existing stories, you can start to create your own original stories in English.
That's a great challenge. It really pushes you to think outside the box and to use the language in new and creative ways.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful stories you can tell is your own personal story.
Our personal stories are so unique and compelling. They give us a chance to share who we are, where we come from, and what matters to us.
Exactly. And when you can share your personal story in English, you're not only connecting with others on a deeper level, you're also demonstrating your vulnerability and your willingness to grow.
It's like we're breaking down barriers and building bridges through the power of storytelling.
Beautifully said. And speaking of breaking down barriers, let's talk about another common challenge that English learners often face, the feeling of hitting a plateau.
Exactly. And one of the most common questions I get from English learners is, do I need to get rid of my accent?
That's a great question. I think a lot of learners feel pressured to sound like a native speaker, to erase their accent completely. It's understandable, of course. We want to be understood.
Yeah.
And we might worry that our accent will prevent us from communicating effectively. But here's the thing. Accents are not bad. In fact, they're a beautiful part of who we are. They reflect our cultural background, our personal history, and our unique journey with the English language.
I love that perspective. It's a reminder that our accents are a part of our identity. They tell a story about who we are and where we come from.
Exactly. And, having an accent doesn't mean you can't speak English fluently or confidently.
That's so true. I've met people from all over the world who speak English with beautiful accents, and their communication is clear, engaging, and inspiring.
Exactly. So instead of focusing on eliminating your accent, I would encourage you to embrace it, to celebrate it, and to use it as a way to connect with others and to share your unique voice with the world.
That's such a powerful message. It's a reminder that language learning is not about erasing who we are. It's about expanding who we can be.
Beautifully said. And, one of the best ways to improve your pronunciation and to reduce any potential communication barriers is to focus on clarity and intelligibility.
So it's not about trying to sound exactly like a native speaker. It's about making sure that your pronunciation is clear enough to be easily understood by others.
Exactly. And there are a few key things you can do to improve your clarity and intelligibility.
Okay, let's take notes. What are those key strategies?
Well, first and foremost, pay attention to the sounds of English. The English language has a lot of sounds that might not exist in your native language, so it's important to train your ear to hear those sounds and to practice producing them accurately.
It's like we're expanding our phonetic repertoire, adding new sounds to our linguistic toolbox.
Exactly. And there are tons of resources available to help you with this, such as pronunciation guides, online dictionaries with audio pronunciations, and even YouTube videos that break down the sounds of English.
It's like having a personal pronunciation coach right at our fingertips.
Exactly. And another important tip is to focus on stress and intonation. English is a stress-timed language, which means that we place emphasis on certain syllables in words and sentences.
So it's not just about pronouncing each word correctly. It's also about understanding the rhythm and melody of the language.
Exactly. And this can be tricky for English learners because Stress and intonation patterns can vary widely depending on the context, the speaker's intention, and even the region or country where English is spoken.
It's like we're adding another layer of complexity to the language, but it's also what makes English so dynamic and expressive.
Absolutely. And, one of the best ways to practice stress and intonation is to listen to native English speakers and try to mimic their rhythm and melody.
So it's back to that technique of shadowing that we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
listening and repeating, trying to match the speaker's tone and emphasis.
Exactly. And another helpful tip is to record yourself speaking English and then listen back to it, paying attention to your stress and intonation patterns.
It's like giving ourselves a little pronunciation checkup, identifying areas where we can improve our rhythm and flow.
Precisely. And, one final tip I would offer for improving your clarity and intelligibility is to focus on enunciation.
Enunciation. Now, that's a word I haven't heard in a while. What exactly does it mean?
Well, enunciation is all about speaking clearly and distinctly, making sure that each sound in a word is pronounced accurately and that your words are not running together.
So it's like we're giving each sound its proper space and attention, making sure that our words are crisp and easy to understand.
Exactly. And this can be especially important for English learners because we might tend to blend sounds together or to drop certain sounds that are not present in our native language.
That makes sense. So what are some practical tips for improving our enunciation?
Well, one helpful technique is to practice tongue twisters. Tongue twisters are those fun little phrases that are designed to challenge your pronunciation and to improve your articulation.
Well, I love tongue twisters. They're always a good laugh, and they really make you focus on those tricky sounds. Do you have a favorite tongue twister that you like to use with your students?
I do. One of my favorites is, she sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are seashells, I'm sure. So if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells.
That's a classic. It's a real tongue twister.
Yeah.
And it really makes you work those S and sh sounds.
Exactly. And another helpful tip for improving your enunciation is to pay attention to the movement of your mouth and tongue when you're speaking.
So it's not just about making the sounds in our throats. It's also about using our mouths and tongues to shape those sounds correctly.
Precisely. And you can actually practice this by looking in the mirror as you speak and observing the movement of your mouth and tongue.
It's like we're becoming more aware of the physical mechanics of speech, the way our bodies work together to produce those beautiful sounds.
Exactly. And as you become more conscious of these movements, you'll find that your enunciation naturally improves.
That's great advice. So we've talked about practicing tongue twisters, observing our mouth and tongue movements. Are there any other tips for improving our enunciation?
Well, one final tip I would offer is to slow down.
Slow down. But don't we want to be able to speak English quickly and fluently?
Of course, but sometimes in our eagerness to sound fluent, we end up speaking too quickly, which can actually make our speech less clear and more difficult to understand.
That makes sense. It's like we're tripping over our own words in our rush to get them out.
Exactly. So especially when you're practicing speaking English, don't be afraid to slow down, to enunciate each sound clearly, and to give your listener time to process what you're saying.
It's like we're giving our speech room to breathe, allowing those sounds to flow smoothly and effortlessly.
Beautifully said. And, speaking of flowing smoothly, I think one of the most important things to remember on your journey to English fluency is to be patient with yourself.
Ah, yes. Patience. That elusive virtue that can be so challenging to cultivate, especially when we're eager to see results and to reach our goals.
It's true. But learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to embrace the ups and downs of the journey.
So how can we cultivate that patience and avoid getting discouraged when progress seems slow or those plateaus feel never-ending?
One helpful tip is to focus on the process rather than the destination. Instead of constantly fixating on the end goal of fluency, try to find joy in the daily practice, the small victories, and the gradual progress you're making.
It's like we're shifting our mindset from I need to be fluent to I'm enjoying the journey of learning English.
Exactly. And another helpful strategy for cultivating patience is to celebrate your progress along the way. No matter how small those achievements might seem, take the time to acknowledge them and to give yourself credit for how far you've come.
Those little celebrations, those moments of self-recognition can really help to boost our motivation and to remind us that we're moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. And sometimes the best way to stay patient is to remind yourself why you started learning English in the first place. What were your goals? What were your dreams? What were those sparks of inspiration that ignited your passion for the language?
It's like reconnecting with that initial sense of purpose, that deep-seated desire that fueled your journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because when you're clear about your why, when you have that strong sense of motivation and direction, those plateaus will seem less daunting, and you'll be more likely to persevere even when things get tough.
That's such an inspiring thought. It's a reminder that language learning is not just about acquiring a new skill. It's about pursuing a dream, about expanding our horizons, and about connecting with the world in a deeper and more meaningful way.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with one final thought. Never stop learning. The English language is vast and ever evolving, and there's always something new to discover, something new to master.
That's so true. It's like we're embarking on a lifelong adventure with the English language, an adventure filled with endless possibilities for growth, discovery, and connection.
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep experimenting, keep challenging yourself, and most importantly, keep that passion for English alive.
That's a perfect note to end on. So to everyone listening out there, we encourage you to embrace the joy of learning English. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, to experiment with different techniques, to find what works best for you, and to celebrate every step you take towards fluency.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There's a vibrant and supportive community of English learners all over the world, eager to connect, share their experiences, and help each other succeed.
So keep practicing, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep that passion for English burning bright.
Thanks for joining us on English Podcast 2.0. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of language learning.